Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Be Bold America. I'm your host, Jill Cody, and I am very excited about our topic today because information literacy has been a passion of mine since I facilitated conferences on information literacy in Washington, D.C., the Czech Republic, and Egypt. And as Buckminster Fuller once said, you can't learn less, you can only learn more. Today our program is The Media and Me. Does media shape our sense of who we are, what we value, and our place in the world? Our guest today will tell us the answers to those questions and more because she is one of 10 authors who've written a new book titled The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy. This guidebook's goal is to empower readers, targeting young adults, but I think, after reading it, excellent for all ages, to become savvy media users who can analyze claims, see through manipulation, and recognize when political and economic interests drive the media we use. Against the backdrop of pundits and politicians promoting fear and creating an avalanche of misinformation, it is understandable how we can become overwhelmed and not be able to discern truth from intentional and creatively manipulative lies. Chris Hedges, an American journalist, author, and commentator, once said, "We are the most self-deluded country in the world." We have big things to do. Our guest today is Dr. Allison Butler. Dr. Butler holds a PhD from New York University and is a director of the Media Literacy Certificate Program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst Department of Communication. Dr. Butler also co-directs the grassroots organization Mass Media Literacy, where she develops and runs teacher trainings for the inclusion of critical media literacy in K through 12 schools. She is the author of numerous articles and books on media literacy, including Educating Media Literacy, Key Scholarship in Media Literacy, and now one of 10 who've brought us The Media and Me. Allison, welcome to Be Bold America.
Thank you, Jill. I'm so excited to be here.
I am too. This is a real passion button for me. And I wanted to ask you, is the best website to direct people to would be censorpress.org?
ProjectCensor.org. Yep, that'd be a great source to go to. Absolutely.
Okay, ProjectCensor.org. And I last year we had Mickey Huff on the program. So
excellent.
Yeah, he was a great guest. So Allison, I was thinking of the most terrifying results of the avalanche of misinformation that continuously bombards us is that it's eroding public confidence in our democracy. Is this one reason you and your fellow authors wrote this new guidebook?
Absolutely. I mean, we as a collection of 10 authors are deeply concerned with the state of our media environment. We're deeply concerned with the state of democracy. I will say that we do our absolute best and work really hard to not be cynical about it, because we all agree that if we're cynical, then the conversation is done. So we're trying to take both a skeptical position. Let's see what kind of questions we can ask. Let's see what else we can learn, as well as, whenever possible, an optimistic position that critical media literacy can really be at the forefront of change.
Well, just to take just a diversion here, I hear a hum in the background of our audio, and I wanted to let you know that our engineer is trying to figure out what that hum is.
Okay.
Just to get back on track, understanding the connection between media literacy and BUST, healthy democracy, they're interconnected. And I love the line that was in the book when it said, "When practicing critical media literacy, we employ a collection of skills that help us move from being passive consumers of media to becoming engaged critics and creators." So what is critical thinking, and who are critically media literate citizens?
I love it. It's a mouthful, right?
Yes.
I guess I'd want to begin by saying that to be critical doesn't mean to dislike, right? I think oftentimes, particularly when we're talking with students, the idea of the word critical prefacing something means that they're going to have to walk into a classroom or walk into a workshop and think, okay, these folks are going to tell me all the stuff that I'm supposed to hate about the media. And that's actually not our endeavor at all. And we're not interested in, to borrow a phrase that I'm sure Mickey used when he was on with you, we're not interested in finger wagging at young people or at our peers, at other adults. When we are using the word critical, and when we're using critical with media literacy, what we're really talking about is taking a little bit of distance, moving a little bit away from the media with which we engage, whatever that media may be: radio, TV, film, social media sites, podcasts, anything at all, and trying to look at those texts as multidimensional objects, trying to see them both for their content as well as the behind the scenes, right? That's a lot of the work with critical media literacy, is looking behind the scenes, looking at the power, taking a political economic perspective where we look at ownership, distribution, and production. So what I think a lot of young people get an unfair reputation for is being just sort of passive recipients of the media, particularly when we're talking about how much time they spend on their phones, or on that phone, how much time they're spending on social media. And what we're trying to argue is that you can spend that amount of time and also be really actively thinking and actively engaging in your media and in your choices.
You also say that being critical does not mean being negative.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing you say when you're talking about critical is getting a thoughtful space.
Yes.
Yes, so that you stop and you take a second look or a third look at something.
Absolutely. I think it's probably, look, these days, I'd be delusional to say it wasn't easy to be negative. I think it's too easy to be negative. So the real work is to try and figure out, how do we fit into this? What can we do? Like, what change can we make? And when there's change that we actually, maybe as individuals or as a community, that we cannot make, what steps could we take towards making it? It's a bit too easy to be negative. We don't delusional optimism, but we want to try and give people the opportunity to be more productive in their activities.
But there are really very powerful forces that want us to be negative.
Yes.
That want us to be angry, that want us to be outraged, that wants to see the glass half empty. It drives ratings. It drives money into their anchor pockets.
Yep.
So thoughts about that?
I mean, I think you're 100% right. I think it is in the mainstream, the corporate media's best interest to keep us in this sort of very tense space between pure docility and anger, right? That's clickbait is a big deal because it keeps us on our screens. It keeps us continuously looking at something else, which then also keeps us looking at advertisements. If we let the media kind of wash over us, it keeps us as docile bodies. Once we start asking questions, once we start saying, hey, why did this get made this way? Or what's the motivation for this? Or who did this? Who made these decisions?
Who benefits?
Who benefits 100%. Once we start asking those kind of questions, once we encourage our students, our young people, our families to start asking those questions, we're no longer docile bodies. And maybe our anger, which I think is probably quite justified, can maybe be a little bit more focused.
Understanding the business of media, we're sort of talking about that right now. Who has the power within it and who profits from it?
Well, in the United States, the vast majority, well over 90% of our media are corporate. They are private, for-profit corporations. So their number one goal is profit. If they happen to entertain us or inform us along the way, that's nice for them, but their real number one is profit. So they're looking to make money. And, we could deconstruct all sorts of media companies. I think probably one of the easiest ones, especially these days because of some of the trouble they've gotten into recently, would be Fox News, right? I mean, Fox News purports to tell you a certain type of truth. It calls itself Fox News, but if you do that behind the scenes work, if you take that critical approach, and I suppose if you pay attention to some of Tucker Carlson's text messages that have been released in the past few weeks, you get a much better understanding of the business of Fox News, which is profit. They know what is going to profit. They knew in the 2020 election that by announcing Biden as the winner, they were going to potentially lose viewers and therefore lose money. And that was a pretty big risk. When you look at the organization of Fox News, you can call yourself lots of things, right? You can name yourself anything that you want. And just by naming it, it becomes a certain type of truth. But if we think about what news is a report on change. And we presume as audience members that our news comes to us from journalists and reporters. That's really expensive. Journalism, investigative journalism, international, global journalism, that's going to cost a news organization a lot of money. And what Fox News, and therefore, cut into their profits. And what Fox News did long time ago, was they didn't hire journalists. They didn't hire reporters. They didn't put people in the field, which costs a lot of money. They hired pundits. They hired people who could speak quite loudly and quite forcefully about their beliefs. But that's not reporting. That's not interrogation. That's not investigation. If you beam somebody into the Fox New York studios or you bring them into the studios, it's significantly less financial output than putting a journalist on the scene. So they figured by their very business model a way to make themselves profit more. And that means that if you and I'm guessing you and I don't do this, but if you and I are watching Fox News, we're getting something that has a name but doesn't follow what you and I might presume to be the structure and organization of an actual news program. But it puts a lot of money in their pockets.
Well, I don't watch Fox News except when I'm on the treadmill at my gym.
And you go that much faster.
And I go that much faster. But one of the banners at the bottom, they don't have the sound on, but I was watching the banner and it said Fox News versus fake news. So the subliminal message is, believe Fox News because everything else is fake. And again, a recent Gallup poll said the American trust in media is at a record low.
Yeah.
And I know that Fox News has had a lot to do with it. They didn't even create an ethics department. My understanding of networks, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, they have ethics departments. And Fox News didn't even create one of those because, as someone told me when I mentioned that, is that they or their audience doesn't really care about ethics.
Correct.
Oh, geez. Yeah. But also Fox News seems to be a good example to me of your hypodermic needle theory of propaganda. That is their ideology. Can you just a minute there on hypodermic needle theory?
Sure. So the hypodermic needle theory comes to us from pretty like the middle half of the 20th century, and it's absolutely connected to propaganda. And the idea was that our media become sort of like a hypodermic needle. Another metaphor is the silver bullet, that it just gets injected into us, and that therefore we are hopeless and to some degree helpless. And part of our work is that we actually want to counter that the media audiences, critical media citizens have some skills and have some tools to protect themselves from that hypodermic needle, from that silver bullet, and that we've hopefully moved forward a little bit with the idea that our media just inject us with this. There's some great public service announcements from the 1950s that show boys sitting up against a tree. It's a kind of nature ideal, and they're reading comic books. One presumes that comic books must have been thought of as particularly dangerous, probably a la video games. And one boy gets up and just starts wailing away on the other one with his comic book. And that's the hypodermic needle, right? Just that you read these messages of potentially violence, and so therefore you are violent. And we would like to argue against that, you know, we can... that violence in the media is absolutely, no doubt, problematic, and it is also representative of a really complicated, complex, and often contradictory relationship that we have to violence that stems from racism and sexism and, our understandings of what "quote unquote" good violence is when the bad guy is defeated, and so our work is to say, it's way more complicated than simply getting a message and suddenly acting on it, right? We want to show that there's so many more layers to that, and that is what propaganda absolutely tries to do, is just say, hey, here, take this, receive it, accept it, move forward, and we're kind of trying to put the brakes on and say, hey, no, we got to look at this in a little bit more of a complex way.
Accept it and make it your own so that you're living what they want you to, and you're thinking what they want you to think. And before we go to break, I wanted to say, after the break, I wanted to continue on Fox so-called news, because I did a bit of an information literacy example that I wanted to share. So you are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. Our topic today is the media and me. The media is shaping our sense of who we are, what we value, and our place in the world. And the book, The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy, was written to empower us all to become savvy media users who can analyze claims and see through manipulation. And visit censoredpress.org, or what was it, Allison?
Project Censored.
Projectcensored.org. And we're speaking with one of the book's 10 authors, Dr. Allison Butler, Director of Media Literacy Certificate Program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst Department of Communication. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Did you know that 6 corporations own 90% of the media in the United States? Isn't it about time we own some too? KSQD 90.7 FM, your community radio station. Your voice, your concerns. Go to www.ksqd.org to get involved and support locally owned grassroots community media. K-Squid, KSQD FM.
We're back. Would you like a friend to hear this interview on the media and me? Well, Be Bold America is available as a podcast and pushed out to 10 podcast platforms. Subscribe for free from your favorite platforms such as Apple, Google, and Spotify. And now Be Bold America's podcast is pushed out by Headliner to YouTube. And I wanted to add that this is community radio, but the podcast is heard around the world. Be Bold America has listeners in Brazil, France, Germany, Iran, Lithuania, to mention a few. So now, Allison, I wanted to get back to Fox News a little bit, because what I did, one critical thought was, okay, Tucker Carlson has the most viewed news show. Hannity was one phone call away from a former president every day. And I'm thinking, who are these people? Because I wanted to know what their street creds were. What got them to where they were, where they have, Tucker Carlson has a home on an island, and they all have several homes, and are very dependent on the money that is generated by those that are watching. And I read, wanting to know the education and street creds they have, that Tucker Carlson, Trinity Yearbook, described him as a member of the Dan White Society. That's a reference to the political assassination who murdered San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. And Dan White was the one that used the Twinkie defense, that he ate too many Twinkies and he was on a sugar high, so therefore he murdered two people. But Carlson, tried also to join the Central Intelligence Agency, but his application was denied. And after which he decided to pursue a career in journalism with the encouragement of his father, who said, and this is double footnoted on Wikipedia, who advised him that journalism, they'll take anybody. So then with Hannity, I'm looking up and I find out that Hannity attended Sacred Heart Seminary in Hempstead, New York, and St. Pius X Preparatory Seminary in Uniondale, New York, and that he attended New York University and Adelphi University, but didn't graduate from either. So there are no street creds. What is your thoughts on that?
Oh boy. Well, I have so many thoughts. Sorry, as I sort of
I know, as I'm swirling around your head. I know.
Right, where to begin? You know what? I think I might be quoting Oprah here, which makes me a little nervous, but I'm going to do it anyway. People tell us who they are.
Oh, that's Maya Angelou.
Then that's better than Oprah. Maybe Oprah was like the guy on the first date tells you who he is or something. I don't know. But Oprah took it down a notch. Yeah, Tucker Carlson has always told us who he is.
Right. Well, say the whole thing by Maya Angelou. Go ahead.
He's always told us who he is. I just question whether or not we've listened, and I include myself in that because I would prefer not to listen to him. But when all the text messages came out in these past few weeks with the Dominion case, you look back at some of Tucker Carlson's previous work, and he wrote a little bit many years ago about Bill O'Reilly, and when Bill O'Reilly was like the top dog at Fox, and that Bill O'Reilly was the Bill O'Reilly that you and I saw on Fox was a character, right? That was a character on television, and we shouldn't expect that character was exactly who he was sort of off screen, right? And there we go. He already told us this story, right? Like he already told us that we were watching a character. So I don't watch Fox News, but sometimes I do try and watch it just to see, what is happening. And oftentimes, if I do, I have such a hard time listening to the content of what they're saying. In part because I mostly find it abhorrent, but there is a tactic to what they're doing. The yelling, the screaming, the interrupting, the cutting people off, particularly cutting off women, or if they ever have people of color or so on and so forth. It's a play in a way. It's a drama. It's characters. And if we're expecting those characters to actually be real people, then we've sort of fooled ourselves, So to your question of what is their cred, it's certainly not as trained journalists by any stretch of the imagination. But I do wonder, did they ever tell us that they were trained journalists, right? So what is it that we are believing or buying into, sometimes quite literally buying into with our dollars, and also ideologically buying into with our time, when we believe that somebody on television behind a desk with a microphone catching the tropes of our traditional serious journalists, even if those folks were problematic as well, we sort of buy into that character. And so that's part of our work, in this text. That's part of the work that my colleagues and I do across our professional spheres, is to say, we got to take a little bit of a closer look. We got to listen a little bit more carefully. And it doesn't always mean that we're listening specifically to the content. We can be listening to the style, to the tone, to the way in which this story, because these are all stories, the way in which these stories are being told to us.
Well, when you were mentioning characters, the image from cartoons with the gentleman with the handlebar mustache and just spinning the corner of his mustache, going ah ha ha, because Rupert Murdoch even said in his deposition, when we talk about it being a business, corporations have to make a profit, Rupert Murdoch said there isn't red or blue, there's only green.
Right.
So these characters are only there to bring in the green. And
exactly.
I do know that Tucker Carlson won a lawsuit from a judge because the judge said he wasn't a journalist. He was an entertainer. And the judge sided with him, saying nobody can believe what he says. It's just so outrageous. Thing is a lot of people believe what he says.
Right.
And
right.
so getting back, I wanted to finish what you started with. Maya Angelou's quote was, when somebody tells you who they are, believe them the first time.
Right.
Yep. And I think I just see Fox News having a huge impact on our democracy, and still is.
Yes.
You know, in your book, you also talked about looking beneath the surface, and you developed 4 themes: meaning, access, representation, and validity. But I also see false equivalency used a lot, and I'm not quite sure where that fits in the 4. Can you tell us more about those 4 themes?
Sure. So to go back to some of your early words, this idea of looking beneath the surface, right? Again, it's trying to say what people are saying to us in the media is important, but it's also what's beneath it. It's what's next door to it. It's what's behind it. It is, as I said earlier, sort of looking at the media as our media text as multidimensional objects, and so trying to really sort of see them in time and space beyond just what's on the screen. And it's the easiest thing to just sit and look at our screens, right? That's what so much of our social media do, is just encourage us to kind of scroll. So that work that we're looking at is to try and take all of those pieces, or take all of our text and show how they're putting pieces together, and then we want to take them apart and look at them as discrete objects. And we want to try to the best of our ability, and I think we're all coming at this from different positions. Like, we're writing this book specifically for young people. We sort of envisioned a middle school to high school audience. We've gotten a lot of feedback saying that people think it would be great for college audiences. My college students really enjoyed it, as well as adults. So when looking at something like a false equivalency, it's really sort of trying to figure out what are different ways that we can kind of explain this pretty abstract this abstract concept that we're putting puzzle pieces together that don't necessarily fit, but we are told that they are made to fit. And we are told that these things are going to get along, that because somebody says something it means something, then we are to agree with it, right? And so it's also about kind of digging into our own potential discomfort with those messages, and saying, to Rupert Murdoch's statement about we are not red states, we are not blue states, what we see is green. I would pause and say, we're not red states or blue states. The vast majority of our states are somewhere in between. They're purple. And when we divide it up and say, red is this and blue is that, and that's all it can mean, it can sometimes mess with how you and I might just live in our everyday worlds, that we could live next door to or across the street from somebody whose political ideology is radically different from ours, and they still actually make pretty good neighbors, right? They're still going to take our mail in when we go on vacation or say nice things about our dog. And yet when we go look at it on the corporate media, we're to be hating all of these people. And we're all getting into arguments, and we're getting into fights all the time. And so I think it sets up these relationships that if we bother to look out our windows or walk out our front doors, or engage with people who disagree with us as civil adults, we're going to see that a lot of those, it's going to take the scales off. It's going to take that delusion off. It's going to move beyond the smoke and mirrors. And that's again, what we're really trying to dig into here is just because somebody tells us something, and just because somebody in power tells us something, and reinforces that repeatedly, doesn't actually mean that that's our life, that that's our experience. And if we are in a position where we feel forced to believe that, then we're getting misinformation and potentially perpetuating it because we haven't been given the opportunity to pause, to slow down, to ask some questions, and to maybe think through this a little bit differently.
Well, one example I saw years ago on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver was a false equivalency, because early on in the climate crisis debate, they would say, well, there's scientists on both sides. There are scientists that believe the climate crisis is happening and others that are, thinks it's a hoax. So one day, John Oliver brought on 3 scientists that didn't believe. I don't know if they were real scientists. They might have been playing a role, to be fair. And then because the percentage back then was 3 out of 100, believe it's a hoax. So then he brought 97 other people on stage. And the visual of 3 people saying climate crisis is a hoax, and then the 97 other people, the visual. And yet what happens often on news shows or talk shows is you have one person representing one side and one person representing the other, and they're not equal, right. And they're presented that way. So you're listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM, many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. I am speaking with our bold guest, Dr. Allison Butler, co-author of The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy. We will be right back after Jim Hightower's I can't talk today. Jim Hightower's commentary titled A Phoenix is Rising.
Our local newspapers are being merged, purged, shrunk, shut down, and looted by Wall Street profiteers. Yet, there's good news. In the towns those media vultures are torching, a phoenix is rising. Hundreds of determined locals, often led by people of color, are finding new ways to pay for and revive top-quality local journalism. For example, the Ferndale Enterprise moved to an old Victorian home, renting upstairs rooms to vacationers to subsidize the paper. Also, while aloof Wall Street owners have no connection to us or our towns, the scrappy new community papers are stressing their grassroots connection by moving into friendlier, more central, street-level spaces such as public libraries and community centers, so that regular people can see them and have direct access to their reporters and editors. Then there's the editor of the Sahan Journal in Minneapolis, who moves his weekly editorial meeting to the offices of various grassroots groups so their members can help shape the paper's coverage. And in Marfa, Texas, the Big Bend Sentinel is literally serving the public, not only with a good weekly, but also with the Sentinel, a combo coffee shop, cozy bar, cafe, event space, and hangout for locals to meet and greet. In ways big and small, dedicated local journalists are experimenting with funding, structure, staffing, etc. to produce the news that democracy requires. Note to Wall Street vultures, these newspaper ventures aren't interested in scaling up to maximize investor profits. As they know, it was corporate cost-cutting, consolidation, and scaling that got us into today's mess of journalistic collapse. And, unlike the Wall Street model, their success is not measured simply by financial return, but also by how they do at keeping citizens informed and engaged. This is Jim Hightower saying, now that's real journalism. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is made possible by you lowdowners who subscribe to our monthly newsletter, The Hightower Lowdown. You know who you are. Thank you.
If you're just joining us, our program today is The Media and Me. We're speaking with our bold guest, Dr. Allison Butler, co-author of The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy, that was written to empower us to become savvy media users, focused on young adults. However, after reading it, I think it's for all ages. And to learn more, visit projectcensored.org. So, Allison, there's you talk about critical thinking skills like decoding bias and identifying propaganda and distinguishing solid arguments from manipulation. And also, one I've always been intrigued with is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Can you talk about cognitive biases and include the Dunning-Kruger effect too?
So, our brains are amazing, I think. And our brains, I think, and the brains of young people, do, a lot of work. But our brains can be fooled. And I'm particularly here, again, thinking of our audience of young people who are probably or our intended audience of young people or folks who are new to media literacy. But it's, teenagers who know way more than the adults in their lives, etc. But I think what we would want to think about is sometimes the more we know about something, the more cautious or the more careful we're going to be, right? So it's kind of funny when we think about critical media literacy, and we think about a lot of the talk that goes along with critical media literacy is that, the more young people, or adults for that matter, know how to critique and make sense of the media, the sort of less influence they will be. It's kind of this automatic thing. The more you know, the less of this. And I think some of us would argue that that might actually not be the case, that sometimes the more we know about a topic, the more we realize how potentially volatile, how potentially destructive it can be. And that's where we want to say is, look, the more we actually start to learn about something, let's be really careful with it. Let's be really cautious with it. Let's think through it much more carefully, that we don't want to think of it as this simplistic or overly simple, and we don't want to overestimate our competence. And in fact, I feel, especially these days, just speaking for myself, that the more that I learn, the more that I realize how much more I have to learn. I think about my own media consumption, and I've been doing this for a little while. Like this is my area of work. This is what I teach. This is what I research. But the more that I'm paying attention, or when I find myself paying attention more, because quite frankly, I like anybody else, need a little bit of a break every once in a while. The more that I have to think, I find myself trying to think even more cautiously, even more carefully, even more trying to think more deeply and to think more thoroughly. I just, for example, drove back from Maryland today. So it's about a 6-hour drive. I was listening to music. I was listening to podcasts. I was listening to stuff that sort of challenged what I knew about the world. Some things that I was familiar with, some things that I wasn't familiar with, making references to books that I had read, to court cases that I did pay attention to. And it was reminding me that, like, we just, there's always an opportunity to think more carefully and more cautiously, and recognize that when we open a little bit of that door, there's just so many more rooms to walk through and so many more hallways to go down. I could butcher this metaphor for quite some time, but I guess the long and short of it is that, going back to your question specifically about the Dunning-Kruger effect, is that what we're trying to do is to really respect how complicated all of this can be, and that if we brush it off, if we treat it as is just it's just the media. Oh, it's just entertainment. It doesn't really matter. Or I never thought that they were going to tell me the truth anyway, or whatever. We're not really giving the attention that we ourselves deserve as media citizens and as citizens of the world, to understand how complex and complicated our relationship with the media are, and how complex and complicated they are, right? You and I might pop into something. We might pop into watching something, or maybe reject watching something because it goes against our worldview, or we find it insulting or offensive. But even that has a significant story, a significant backstory, a long history of getting to where it is now. And that's part of the work that we want to do, is just show how absolutely complicated it is. It's one of the things that I think sometimes at the beginning of the semester drives my students insane, but by the end of the semester, they're sort of on board with it, which is whenever they tell me something they know or something they believe, how do you know that? How do you believe? Why do you believe that? Where did you learn that? And I do it with big things, but I also do it with like little things, like, how did you learn where this classroom was? And they're like, what? Like, we go to school here. I'm like, yeah, but you had to learn it at some point. And really just trying to peel apart those layers, that the world that we experience, that we might have a great deal of confidence, or a great deal of confidence that we have absolutely zero confidence at all whatsoever, is really much more complex.
One comment that you wrote in the book was about Charles Cooley, and what the term he coined was the looking glass self. And that, because locally we have, there have been some school district lawsuits, and San Mateo County is not far from us, and they have a lawsuit accusing social media companies of creating addictive platforms. And one quote in there was, "There is simply no historic analog to the crisis the nation's youth are now facing." And there's another lawsuit from a school district. And in that lawsuit, it said social media is linked to increases in mental, emotional, developmental, and behavioral disorders. They include cyberbullying, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, and suicide-related outcomes. And it seems to me this term that was in your book encapsulates what these school district lawsuits are talking about, the looking glass self. So tell us more about what that means.
So the idea of the looking glass self is that we don't just form our identities solely on our own, or maybe even solely through our immediate household or our immediate family, right? That our identities, somewhat like a mirror, like a looking glass, are formed by the reflections or the refractions that we get from others, that we get from our larger social institutions, and certainly from our media. And that so part of how we understand, particularly maybe in 2023 or in the early part of the 21st century, however we want to kind of break down the time frame of this, is through our digital media, and certainly to your point, through our social media. And so it's a way of trying to understand who we are by maybe exploring who we're told that we are. I just did an activity with my class. We did a little activity in my media literacy class on trying to build a slightly more nuanced understanding of privacy. And I, much to the detriment of my soul in terms of the state of the environment, I printed out the terms of service and the privacy policies for a bunch of different social media or streaming sites. It was an absurd amount of paper, but I did it because I wanted them to truly see the depth of this. And I had them read in class. They spent about 45 minutes working on it in small groups. They read through all the terms of service and all the privacy policies. And then we did like a little compare, contrast, a little discussion, etc. And they all realized looking at this that, one, they had never read a term of service. They'd never read a privacy policy. They just clicked right by it and realized in clicking right by it that they had signed away a fair amount of their rights. Snapchat, for example, the social media site that you take a pic and it disappears so you share it with a friend and it disappears within a certain amount of time. By signing up for Snapchat, the Snap company owns your face. They own your likeness, and they own your likeness before or after you use, including using the app. They own it before or after you use it. So the students are figuring out that they're tapping into the Snapchat company is tapping into your microphone. All of the privacy policies that we looked at in terms of service that we looked at had no lawsuit clauses. So if you are in some way, shape, or form harmed by these social or deem that you have been harmed, you are not allowed to start or join a class action lawsuit. The most that you can request is arbitration, and that arbitration can be denied if it's deemed too cumbersome for these companies. So part of our identities are to some extent not just being formed, but actually being owned and restricted by these corporations. And the reality of their lives, of course, mind you, this is a 75-minute class. We weren't about to solve all of this conundrum in one class period. But they all kind of came to the conclusion that they get it. It's problematic. They don't like it. It's really uncomfortable. They do find a lot of their social media use very stressful and anxiety producing, but they don't see a way out. It is where their friends are. It is how they socialize. And this class that I teach happens to be mostly seniors, a few juniors, but mostly seniors. And they are graduating into a job market that is going to expect them to use social media professionally rather than personally, but expect them to be adept at this, to get whatever message is out, no matter, I mean, if they're going to work for corporations or they're going to work for grassroots nonprofit organizations, one needs to get their message out, and therefore they would be setting themselves up for professional failure by not knowing how to use these technologies. So that's just I think a pretty clear example of what I've said so much in this time is how complicated and complex it is. They recognize that this stuff is deeply problematic, and it's a bind in which they find themselves needing to be. And that's really, that's upsetting. That's stressful. That's anxiety producing. It's the is and the ought argument. This is how it is, but it's not necessarily how it ought to be. And I don't like to leave them terribly depressed. And I certainly don't want to leave your listeners, terribly depressed. We also really want to think about what are ways that we can do to make some degree of change. What are ways that we can do to not feel so, and maybe not be so hopeless and helpless.
Well, it is shocking to think that a social media company owns your face.
Yeah.
You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
This evening at 6 p.m., Kat Brown will fill in for host Lori Katz on her KSQD program, Cats on Dogs. Kat will be talking about viewing our companion animals as a link to thinking about larger issues, including our ambivalent relationship to livestock, wild animals, birds, insects, and food production, noticing ties to the climate change and environmental decline. The big question, of course, is how do we change our perspective if they are part of the problem? Guest will be psychotherapist and author Marilyn Duhamel of Earth's Dialogues blog, who may help us sort this out.
And we're back with Allison. And Allison, in these last few minutes, I'd like to ask you what your ideas you might have for keep doing and stop doing and start doing as they relate to this becoming media savvy. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you another question, which is appreciating how free speech and media literacy rely on each other.
Yeah. So we're living, I think, in a difficult time with free speech and I think free speech and something like the First Amendment in many ways are getting weaponized right now. When we look at the tech oligarchs, and certainly Elon Musk is a kind of a perfect example of it these days, these are the folks that are deciding what our speech counts and how our speech matters. And they're making decisions about who can stay and who cannot stay on the platforms. And while there's certainly some folks who have been quote unquote canceled that I'm perfectly fine as a human being to not hear from again, the idea that a tech company is deciding who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak, I think is fundamentally problematic. And that's, again, a place where critical media literacy comes in, is the idea of saying, let's dig deeper into this. What does free speech mean? What are the parameters that are put onto free speech? Because there are parameters, right? You're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. That presents an obvious danger. So we know that there are already restrictions to free speech, but who is in charge of determining those restrictions? Who dictates them? Who do we seem to agree with and make it okay with when somebody is deplatformed on Facebook or on Twitter or so on and so forth. And so critical media literacy, we in general argue vociferously against censorship, but we're also trying to better understand what it means to censor and who is in charge or who seems to have put themselves in charge of censoring others.
Well, it's good to remember that our free speech pertains to the government and not to corporations. So, they are, somebody like Elon Musk is triaging what he thinks is free speech. And that is a very dangerous place to be.
Yes.
Another quick question I had, too, is how do you see this guidebook being used by young people? Because it's in book form. And yet my understanding is that the youth, they just scroll for their news, scroll. Is some of this content, which is very rich and very important, going to be maybe segmented and put into different social media platforms so as they scroll, they would learn what false equivalency is, or as they scroll, they would learn what validity is, or,
Yeah, I think so. Part of our goal with this, and one of the things that we're really working hard to do, is making sure that we can get this text into schools, and particularly into school libraries. And ideally, we can do that without costing schools or teachers too much money. We know that our school systems these days are strapped for cash, and we don't want to add to that problem. We want to make this book as available as possible. At this stage in its publication, yeah, it's absolutely about picking up a book. We're hoping young people might be interested in that, but they can pick and choose. It's not a book that you have to read from chapter 1 through to the end. We really envision it as what topic are you interested in? What's bugging you? What questions do you have? Pop in and pop out of the book as you need. It's going to be around for you. It'll be there if you change your mind and want to think about something else. It'll be there if you do want to read it cover to cover. You can kind of make that decision. But you're absolutely right. We do also want to think about ways to reach young people where they are, where they're living, and how we can best bring this topic to them. We're all super interested in, doing this kind of work, having these conversations with you, also being in schools, working directly with teachers, working with librarians, with media specialists in ways to make this book the absolute most available and most approachable for, quite frankly, anybody who wants to read it, right? What can we do as the authors of this text? What can we do as scholars and teachers and researchers and activists to help?
Your chapter 8 really does lead into our Keep, Stop, Starts.
Yep.
What do you want to do? Fits right into them. So why don't you share with us some of that?
So we end the book with practical suggestions, and with the acknowledgement that you might have some interests of taking this further. You might want to get really deeply involved. You also might just want to learn a little bit, more about yourself. So it's a whole chapter focused on what you want to do. Really, it starts with just the idea of how might you start to think a little bit differently. By reading this text, you're thinking a little bit differently. We encourage any user of the media, ourselves included, to slow down, right? Our mainstream media, particularly our social media, are really designed for us to zip through them, to just keep scrolling, that reading a headline is enough. And what we're saying is, slow down a little bit, take a little bit more time, read past the headline, look for the original source, see what spending more time with a text versus zipping through can maybe help. Recognizing, of course, our own value as human citizens and our human rights, and maybe swapping out, again, we're not here to finger wag. We're not here to say that your media choices are poor or bad or you should stop them. But maybe with a little bit of this learning, you might think about some other texts. You might want to look at some other sources and see what else might be out there. So we try and provide some really practical skills. The activity that I did with my class the other day when we were doing terms of service and privacy, one of the things that we agreed on by the end of the class that might be just a teeny, tiny step is when I asked my students to talk about what they were learning and what they were thinking about it, all of their answers started with, well, they wrote this and they wrote that and they said this. And I just said, who's they? How about we just try to talk about, we don't know who the individuals are, but maybe even job titles, the legal team at Snapchat, the financial folks at Netflix, right? So that we're not being so vague in our assignation of what these companies are determining about us, that we're really trying to work to have a slightly better understanding of who is making these choices. So it can be teeny tiny little things like just shifting your thinking or shifting your vocabulary to maybe doing something more like getting involved directly in your community. Obviously, one of the things that we think is super duper important is for a little bit of time, maybe step away from that corporate media. Try and look at more independent media. Try and look at your local media. What's happening in your community? Our mainstream corporate media have a real big swath of audience, and that might not be your life. let's look at what's going on in your life, in your community, and how you could maybe get more invested in that. And I think if we have a better understanding of where we live, we might begin to have a better understanding of the larger world in which we live.
Have you heard of NewsGuard? Yes, NewsGuardTech.com. They say they employ a team of journalists and experienced editors, no AI, artificial intelligence, to produce reliable ratings and scores for news and information. But they do have a paywall. It's $5 a month. But knowing about them, is that something people could, go to as a resource? As well?
I mean, I would try to see. I mean, Project Censor doesn't have a paywall.
And
that's
I think true.
That, that says a lot. I think a concern. I'm never going to tell anybody not to go to some place. Like, we have to learn from a variety of resources. NewsGuard does have corporate connections. They do have some corporate funding, and so you just want to be thinking about that. We want to take a critical media literacy approach to that and say, what does that mean? Like, how does that go into their structure and their organization? What is the purpose of this paywall? There are certain paywalls that you and I might come up against where we're like, yeah, it is worth my money to spend this. I do want to spend some of my dollars on this. But I think our job is to really understand what we're getting into before we choose that paywall. Because once we open that door, even if we stop paying them, even if we say, okay, I'm done, I don't want the subscription anymore, they have our information, they have our data, and they can be making determinations and selling or sharing our information. So the paywall isn't always entirely problematic, but it is cause for a bit of a pause, a little bit of a slowdown, a little bit of research. Let's go somewhere else and find out why it is they might be asking me for this money, and is it worth is it worth it? Should I be giving my money to this corporation?
Well, you just did an excellent example of critical media literacy, right, for the listeners to walk right, to talk about it and think about it like that. Well, Allison, I couldn't get to all my questions I wanted to talk about. Deep fakes and metaverses and so much more. But thank you for being our bold and impressive guest today. You and your co-authors have written an imperative book. It's not just for youth. I really want to stress that. It's for all of us to become critically media literate citizens. Our future depends on it. So, Allison, thank you for dropping by today.
Thank you so much. This was really great.
It's our pleasure. And to learn more, remember to visit projectcensored.org. What's next on Be Bold America? Well, we'll be taking a little time off for Easter Sunday, so our next show will be Sunday, April 23rd, on Climate Restoration Cannot Wait. We all want a safe climate, one that humans can survive for a long time. Yet last week's newly released report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, quote, delays of even a few years would most likely make the goal unattainable. We know what we need to do. All that is missing is leadership. Our interview guest will be Peter Fikowski. Peter Fikowski is an MIT-educated physicist and engineer, serial entrepreneur, philanthropist, social innovator, and author. He also worked at NASA and the Fairchild Schlumberger Artificial Intelligence Lab in Palo Alto, California. When it became clear that global warming would endanger the future for us all, Peter launched the Foundation for Climate Restoration. So please join Be Bold America on Sunday, April 23rd at 5 p.m. for Climate Restoration Cannot Wait. As a reminder, Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Now you may listen to the show anytime for free by subscribing through your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple, Google, and Spotify. I want to give a special thank you to Be Bold America program engineer Eliza James and to our station's program director Howard Feldstein. You are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz. Many voices, one station. Listen worldwide online at ksqd.org. Stay tuned for Cats on Dogs. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start,